A delegation from the DPRK has arrived in Singapore to work on logistics for the summit and, according to the White House, meet a pre-advanced U.S. team. The White House has confirmed that DPRK's Yong Chol, the vice chairman of the ruling Workers' Party, was set to head to U.S. on Wednesday after meeting Chinese officials in Beijing. The reports indicate that planning for the Kim-Trump summit, initially scheduled for June the 12th, is moving ahead after Mr. Trump called it off last week and then on again. Let's take a look at this.
Progress in U.S. diplomacy with the DPRK used to take years. Now it's measured in days after the second meeting of the DPRK and South Korea leaders in as many months. A U.S. negotiating team led by Sung Kim, a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea and former nuclear negotiator with Pyongyang, arrived in the DPRK for talks. The visit suggests a sort of advanced planning for a possible summit may now be underway. On Saturday, President Trump expressed optimism.
A lot of people are working on it. It's moving along very nicely. So we're looking at June 12th in Singapore. That hasn't changed. And it's moving along pretty well.
Trump repeated his offer of economic assistance on Sunday. I truly believe North Korea has brilliant potential and will be a great economic and financial nation one day. At their Saturday summit, the two Korean leaders discussed the U.S. offer of economic assistance in return for denuclearization.
I told Chairman Kim that if he decides to put into practice a complete denuclearization, President Trump is willing for economic cooperation in ending hostile relations.
But the DPRK hasn't budged on this proposal. Pyongyang says it's not ready to swap missiles for money. An article in the official Workers' Party newspaper in Pyongyang said this on Sunday. U.S. media is still building up public opinion that the DPRK comes to the negotiating table with the U.S. in a hope to get economic aid. The DPRK paper called the U.S. proposal impudent and rubbish. So both leaders from the DPRK and the U.S. appear to want this summit, but officials on both sides still have many details to work out, including the terms of denuclearization before the summit. Could it be all or nothing, as the White House has demanded, or gradually, as Pyongyang has proposed?
So the world is asking this question, the Kim-Trump summit to be or not to be. So far, we seem to have the answer that is likely to go ahead. But whether or not, let's ask our experts. We have in our Beijing studio Zhao Tong, a fellow from Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Good to see you again, Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing. In Medford, United States, we have Sun Young Lee, a Kim Kuk Korea Foundation professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School at Tufts University. Welcome, sir, to our program as well. Let me begin with you, Professor Lee. Tell me about your assessment now. The pre-advanced team from the White House is going to Singapore. Well, DPRK has confirmed the deputy chair of the Workers' Party, the ruling party, is going to New York. So are we reading very positive signs from both sides?
Well, President Trump's sudden snub through that unconventional, discourteous love letter last week, I'm sure came as a shock to Kim Jong-un. I am certain North Korea did not see that coming because there is no precedent for that by the United States putting pressure on North Korea and getting North Korea to chase after the U.S. It's always been the other way around. And North Korea showed thereafter its sincerity or its desire, eagerness to hold a summit meeting. So I think the summit will take place. It's more likely than not that it will take place. And there are political gains to be had by both sides, of course. The fact that Kim Yong Chol, who is designated by the U.S., blacklisted by the U.S. and by South Korea, is making this long trans-Pacific trip to come to New York and perhaps even Washington. It's another example that North Korea's public outreach, its diplomatic outreach, it's really a very effective sanctions-busting ploy or strategy. This is the way North Korea comes to get the U.S. and much of the world to relax sanctions against the regime and to be accepted as a legitimate power.
Professor Lee has been reading the playbook, so-called, of DPRK for years, and therefore he has been giving his judgment. But from your perspective, Mr. Zhao, is this going to be different? I think that is the question to be asked, isn't it?
Well, I think it's different.
In what way? To what degree?
Many people are saying North Korea seems very desperate to have this summit. They want this photo opportunity for Kim and Trump together. That will give North Korea tremendous gain by itself. But I think North Korea aims much further than simply a summit meeting. After acquiring a nuclear deterrent, now North Korea is making a strategic plan for its future foreign policy. It wants to build a good relationship with the United States. That's its strategic objective. It wants to balance between the two big powers, maintaining equally good relations. So I think North Korea is looking far.
Two big powers, meaning China and
United States. I think North Korea is looking far beyond a simple summit at Singapore. It wants this to be the start of a repaired relationship with the United States. And therefore we see Kim Jong-un sending the vice chairman of the Workers' Party to New York. That's the first high-level visit from North Korea to the United States in the last 18 years. So I think all those high-level signals from North Korea shows North Korea is committed to a much more important strategic objective simply, than simply a meeting in early June.
Then, if that question is answered in this way, it's only fair that we ask our American guests about whether there is another bigger plan from the U.S. side. Well, whether or not that is the question, isn't it? We are now joined in Chicago, United States, Carl Friedhoff, a fellow at the Public Opinion and Asia Policy at Chicago Council of Global Affairs. Mr. Friedhoff, do you think there's a grand plan also coming from Washington about the DPRK issue and beyond? If there is, what it is?
Well, trying to analyze any grand plan coming out of the Trump administration is always going to be problematic. But it does look like something is starting to emerge, and I've personally been somewhat heartened by the fact that now we're seeing very senior aides go to Pyongyang to work this out with a former negotiator with North Korea, someone very high level from the Defense Department, and also someone from the National Security Council. So it does look like something is coming together, and now the Trump administration is actually taking preparation quite seriously to try to hash out what exactly is going to be discussed in Singapore on June 12th, when and if this summit does actually take place.
Well, Professor Lee, if I did check a little bit information about you, I have noticed some photo of yours. During the Obama administration, you were invited into the White House, in fact, in the Oval Office, and talked to President Obama about the DPRK issue. One of those briefing President Obama. I did check that information, and therefore, probably this is a great occasion for you to help us understand what are some of the information that the President needs to be prepared, and how the plan for a meeting of this level is likely to be done. Who does it take to do this plan, and usually what are their roles? Well, the current ones, DPRK and the United States, sending toward each other, are they going to be up to the level, Professor Lee? A lot of questions, but you have to help us answer that.
Well, due to the strategic, by virtue of the strategic location of the Korean Peninsula, there will always be other players to play an influential role in Korean affairs, meaning obviously China, but also Russia. Don't be surprised if Vladimir Putin just pops up, shows up in Pyongyang, as he did in July 2000, just 1 month after the first ever inter-Korean summit, to reassert himself and Russia's influence in the region. So Japan is also a factor. Japan could dramatically engage North Korea in normalization talks, as the two countries used to discuss these issues, with a tacit agreement that Japan would give North Korea $10 billion. That was in the 90s. Now North Korea would seek a lot more than that. So there could be more dramatic surprises coming our way. With respect to how prepared President Trump should be, first, don't underestimate North Korea. I know North Korean leaders have this bizarre image, and many people mock them, underestimate them. That never works to the other party's interest. Don't underestimate North Korea, and also be prepared if North Korea strikes a very hard bargain and makes some unreasonable demands, like the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea. I believe Kim Jong-un will not do that, take the opposite route, and thereby come across as very reasonable. But I think it is really impossible physically to get North Korea to dismantle all of its weapons of mass destruction programs within the next couple of years. So President Trump, whatever he signs on to, a joint statement or agreement, it will be politically very difficult for him to walk away from it, unlike the Iran deal, which was negotiated by his predecessor. So there's a lot on the table. There's a lot at stake for President Trump. He may be falling walking right into a trap.
Well, talking about trap or not, we are already seeing some footages coming from DPRK earlier, the dismantling of the nuclear site. At least that's the footage they show to the outside world. Having said that, though, Mr. Friedhoff, Professor Lee did not answer my question directly, but I will ask that question to you once again about, from the U.S. side, who do you think is up to the job to brief the president? To what extent the president should be briefed? Some of the most critical issues from the U.S. side, what do you think are some of the most important points the U.S. has to guard eventually for a deal, if there is? Mr. Friedhoff.
So the question for me becomes, who is willing to make the bigger jump? Is it a bigger jump for North Korea to give up its weapons, or is it a bigger jump for the United States to accept a North Korea that has some limited nuclear capability? Right now, we don't know who is going to do that. Of course, who is going to be in charge of the briefing? There are very good Asia hands that are now handling this, including the ambassador to the Philippines, Ambassador Sung Kim. He's been a long-time negotiator with them, and I hope that President Trump will listen to him and take him seriously. He's been a diplomat, including in South Korea, where he was also the ambassador. And these issues that are going to arise, of course, we all know about the denuclearization. We all know about the weapons of mass destruction, as Professor Lee mentioned. But one of the things that is going to come up is the idea of this peace treaty, or perhaps not a peace treaty, but a peace agreement, a peace regime. And if that is going to happen, one of the undiscussed things is what happens to the conventional weapons that are all along the DMZ. I think this is something that is an open door that needs to be pushed on. If North Korea is going to say that it is serious about striking some kind of peace agreement with South Korea specifically, then it needs to undertake a program that is going to pull off its artillery and rocket batteries back from the DMZ and take Seoul out from under the gun. That's going to be a very important step, but thus far no one is discussing it, as they continue to focus on arguably the more important issue of nuclear weapons and ICBMs.
And yet, Mr. Zhao, if I could be frank here, a lot of things that Mr. Friedhoff had just mentioned are really interlinked with one another, with the nuclear issue of the DPRK. And if I could just point out, Mr. Friedhoff, to Mr. Zhao as well, that one of the realities we're facing right now is the DPRK has already got its nuclear capability. The only thing that we have not got is the U.S. plan to do it. So that is what we're focusing right now. I guess, Mr. Zhao, the reality is there. What about the plan?
Yes, our American guest asked the question of which side will make that big jump. I think
it depends on what big is about, and to what extent, from whose perspective.
Exactly, and my bet would be it has to be the United States, because North Korea has...
Why are you saying this, Mr. Zhao? Is it because China is an ally of the United States, and therefore you always emphasize the role of the United States to do a so-called bigger jump?
No, this is a role for the U.S. To make big concessions, because North Korea has no room to make fundamental nuclear concessions. It depends on nuclear deterrence for regime survival. But the United States already lost its coercive leverage with North Korea. There is no way U.S. can launch a disarming military strike on North Korea. There is no way U.S. can can work with Russia and China to impose additional sanctions on North Korea with another UN Security Council resolution.
Not under the current circumstances, at least.
Because I believe North Korea would be smart enough to continue refraining from major military provocations. North Korea would not give any additional excuse for China and Russia to cooperate with the United States to tighten the sanctions against North Korea. So I see the U.S. has no additional leverage. So it has to, I think, face the reality and take a more pragmatic and realistic approach.
Professor Lee, once again, I go back to your role of briefing the President of the United States during the last administration on the DPRK issue. In the Oval Office, I'm sure he asked you many questions, and I know you wouldn't tell me. But the thing is, now you see a President of the United States, President Trump, trying to push the political apparatus in Washington, trying to make sure a summit could happen, even though from the other side, the political apparatus, as well as some administration officials and those coming from different departments, are saying, no, this is too quick, we can't get things done, it's impossible. But the President insists. So what about this relationship within Washington, from your perspective, Professor Lee, about how things should happen and would happen?
Well, there are understandably many skeptics in Washington and throughout the world when it comes to nuclear diplomacy vis-a-vis North Korea. North Korea did shut down, decommission that nuclear testing site last week, but North Korea doesn't have any further need to conduct underground nuclear tests. It's made its point with the most recent test back in September last year, which was a very powerful thermonuclear test. India and Pakistan, interestingly, each has tested to date just 6 underground tests, and those were far weaker, smaller in yield than the North Korean tests last year. And the last time that either country did that was 20 years ago in May 1998.
Right.
My point is, North Korea is very good at making basically meaningless gestures like decommissioning, shutting down an exhausted testing site that it
Mr.
doesn't
Lee,
really
if I could,
need.
you are saying, Mr. Lee, if I jump in, you are saying that some of the administration officials and those coming from different departments of political apparatus in Washington are correct that the President should not go ahead with the summit with the DPRK. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, it's too late for that. If Trump walks away, then he will come across as the petulant party, uninterested in peace and reconciliation, and Kim Jong-un would really shine as the peacemaker and Trump as the troublemaker. Well, we shouldn't be surprised if we hear some stunning news from General Kim Yong Chol, who might even say that Kim Jong-un might want to visit the UN General Assembly this fall. And that would be construed as another sign of North Korea's genuine opening and outreach, and it may be. But my point here is, when it comes to nuclear diplomacy, it's unlike any other kind of negotiation except for peace negotiations during war. It is international politics played at the highest level, say for waging war. So it is exceedingly unlikely that North Korea has made up its mind to completely give up its nuclear weapons, even for $1 trillion.
All right, maybe dollar is not what they exactly want alone, but rather a peace treaty. How about that, Mr. Friedhoff, to prepare for something like a peace treaty? And step by step for DPRK and the U.S. to work together, of course, with the involvement of many other players as well on the road. What does it take? Where to start, Mr. Friedhoff?
The challenge is going to really be on the U.S. side for this. If we look at the administration, there are several people who are known hawks on North Korea, and what they do not want to see is any kind of negotiating process that's going to be dragged out. And that is certainly the concern with North Korea, considering the history of how this has gone in the 90s and in the early 2000s about negotiations and how they've played out, and how North Korea has been able to extract concessions. So if that is indeed the case and these things start to play out in that way, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the President from people within his own administration saying that this is North Korea up to its own tricks. Now, if we're going to talk about a peace treaty, the United States, or North Korea rather, has said that it understands military drills are going to continue. It has said that it's not going to exactly protest that U.S. troops stay in South Korea. One of the things I think can happen is there can be a partial drawdown of U.S. troops in South Korea. If you look at the history of this, in the 1950s, there were approximately 75,000 soldiers present there, and there have been 4 to 5 distinct drawdown points of 5,000 soldiers or more throughout, the past 60 to 70 years. The shortest time that has happened over, where one drawdown to the next, was 13 years, and we're now starting to enter that phase. So if there is going to be a partial drawdown, say 5,000 troops, we saw North Korea dismantle or supposedly dismantle its nuclear test site, what Professor Lee characterized, I think, correctly as something that was largely for show, then the United States could do the same with troops in South Korea. Say we draw down from 28,500 to, say, 23,500, that's a withdrawal of 5,000. Is that still enough to maintain U.S. military readiness? I think that it probably would be. And one of the things we hear about the U.S. troops in South Korea, kind of grimly referred to as a tripwire. That is, the whole idea is that they are there to ensure that if there is any kind of conflict, not only can they hold North Korea off, but U.S. troops will die in significant enough numbers to ensure a U.S. response. I think we can easily accomplish that with 23,500 rather than 28,500, and that's something that the United States should consider.
From the other two guests' explanations, Mr. Zhao here in Beijing, it seems that we should also have a debate about whether this summit is a show or is it the start of the real negotiation? What do you think?
I think it's more like a show, but it's a very important show. It's a show because neither side, neither North Korea or the United States, is ready to make any radical concessions. North Korea is not going to surrender its nuclear weapons. The U.S. is not ready to dramatically draw down its troop deployment or ending its alliance relationship with South Korea. Therefore, any agreement emerging from the summit would have to be a symbolic agreement. But it's an important show because it could start a long process of direct engagement.
I see.
They can start with meaningful steps. I disagree with Professor Lee. I think all the immediate efforts North Korea take to close down the test site, to suspend missile and nuclear tests, maybe North Korea would even agree to suspend the fissile material productions. Those are all meaningful steps to effectively freeze North Korea's program.
I see.
And if the U.S. doesn't have this meeting, it wouldn't even have this opportunity to freeze and cap North Korea's capabilities. So it could start a long process of direct engagement and trust building. That would be the most effective way to address North Korea's paranoia in the long run and makes North Korea less dependent on nuclear weapons in future.
We'll see what kind of opportunity is that and for whom and who will take it to the full extent for the good of whom. Well, for now, I want to thank the three of you for being with us. Zhao Tong, Sun Young Lee, Karl Friedhoff. Thank you so much for being with us, gentlemen. Really appreciate it.